Good morning and welcome back to the AI Squared Summit. I'm Hans van Ossam. I'm the director of the AI Squared Center at the University of Florida. And I'm so excited that you're still here. Last day, we're going to focus on ethics today, which is a huge topic. And we're going to start it off with a panel of industry folks to talk about academic integrity. I would say academic integrity is the question I get most, and when you read the paper, that is the topic that everybody wants to talk about because all our students are cheating with AI. And so we can have a conversation about that. What is it that we should do about this? How can industry help us with that? How can we collectively come up with approaches that really focus on student learning and try to instill in the students that they have to learn material and that AI is a great tool that they can potentially use at times. So I'm happy to be joined by industry folks from Packback, Turnitin, and Studiosity, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Kelsey Berenger. I'm the CEO of Packback. I started my career as a high school chemistry and physics teacher and joined Packback when it was just 20 teenagers with a dream, and I took over as CEO 3 years ago. So excited to be here and excited to be surrounded by some lovely partners that are very familiar. So thanks for having me.
Good morning. My name is Megan Sexton. I'm a senior customer success manager at Turnitin. Very excited to be here this morning. And for those who may not be familiar with Turnitin, we specialize in formative feedback solutions in writing assessment, whether that's handwritten or digital assessment, as well as secure high-stakes assessment.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Sternal. I'm a regional director for Studiosity North America. Studiosity is an Australian organization, as I'm sure you would have heard throughout the week, and we're really excited to be here. For those of you that don't know what we do, we help institutions and their students develop critical thinking skills and self-validate their learning. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Great, thank you very much. So academic integrity is typically, guarded and defined by a student honor code, which every institution has. And we've had these discussions at the University of Florida does the honor code change when we have AI? How do we look at academic integrity in an age of AI? Are there things we have to change? What do you think, Kelsey?
Yeah, I think the reasons why a student might be academically dishonest, I don't think have changed. We just released a survey where we surveyed about 1,000 students, and there have been other students surveyed about why they decide to completely 100% offload their thinking to AI, and it's because I ran out of time, I have a job, I have a family, whatever it might be, I ran out of time, or I don't feel connected with the subject matter. I don't know why I need to do this. It's a gen ed that I didn't sign up for by choice. I have to take this. Or maybe I lack skills and I lack confidence. Those have always been the reason why students are academically dishonest. So the reason hasn't changed. There's just now a new path. And I genuinely think that everything has changed as it relates to academic integrity and honor code, because in the past, pre-Gen AI, everything was provable with forensic evidence. Now what we have is something that's incredibly hard to prove, and it's a losing battle. And we're in a little bit of an arms race if we put on our traditional academic integrity hats. So I think the shift has to be in the codes, the training, the guidelines. Just we really do have to shift as an academic community. And if we don't shift quickly, I think we lose motivating our students and giving them the skills they need to be successful post-academic career.
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of that. I think if I got in my time machine and I went back to before ChatGPT became available in late 2022, when I would look at student honor codes, the word that would come up all the time was plagiarism. And Turnitin's been in that plagiarism space for a very long time. And I think we've always defined historically plagiarism as real world text written by a human being, that we're taking that and we're not citing that work. In the age of AI, I don't know that the definition of plagiarism has changed much. It's just that we're adding the caveat that maybe the work is coming from a human or maybe it's coming from a machine. And I think we get confused at times when we redefine plagiarism and we still think of it in that scope of plagiarism means human writing. I see that a lot of institutions that I talk to struggle with developing a, I would say, like university or college level academic integrity policy. So I don't know that honor codes have actually changed on the website, but how we are thinking about it is evolving. And I think that that evolution has to include our thoughts on what ethical use actually means. And I think that depending on who you talk to and what discipline you're in, that can mean different things. Specifically in proctoring, I think the biggest threat right now are AI agents. So with ExamSoft assessment solutions and high stakes assessment, we have an ability to mitigate any sort of AI agentic use within those assessments, but that's not true for every application that we use. So I think that it's twofold. It's like, are we using a large language model's language, pretending that it's our own? Should we be treating that as a plagiarized source? And how are we understanding what tools are available to students that might be browser add-ons or other things of that nature?
Everything they said. No, just a few more points on that. So when you think about honor codes, even before AI, contract cheating has been around for about 20 years now. The term was first used in, I believe, 2006. And that is, passing off work as your own that was done by someone else. And so AI just really made that more prevalent. So it's pulled back the veil and perhaps shown some holes in assessment design that needs to change. Even going even further back, ghostwriting on campuses was widely advertised in the 1960s. So this isn't a new problem. It's just that the opportunity is greater for students. And if they feel that there's pressure from others who are using it, then they'll feel left behind. So this really brings in the teaching and learning piece as well.
Yep.
Yeah, great. No, and I think we have to change what we do too, right? So we can't only blame it on the students, I think. And then sometimes we focus on that and say, well, students these days, they do this or that or the other thing. And really what they're doing is they're using the technologies and everything that's available to them, which ultimately isn't that what we should be encouraging them to do, right? So there's a big discussion about, you shouldn't use AI at all. And then, okay, well, when they graduate, they do have to know how to use it appropriately and ethically. And so there is a big, so a question I get often is, what technology is the best to detect cheating? So how do your companies fit in that picture, or is that not an approach you're taking?
I think at this point we know AI detection is a hot topic, and ultimately an artifact, but not a conviction, right? I think we can use AI detection very cautiously as one piece of a much larger picture. For us at Packback, it's really about three things, maybe more. I'm simplifying it to three. But all right, we're gonna offer AI detection and be really cautious about how we put this in front of students, faculty, and institutions, giving a lot of choice into how this is used. We also believe in reciprocity. So whatever reporting a faculty member can see about originality, it needs to be reflected in the student experience too. And we frame it as feedback on originality. It's feedback on originality, it's not detection. Second is, I went back to why do students actually engage in these behaviors? It's because maybe they feel a lack of support, they feel a lack of confidence, and if I feel a lack of support and confidence, the likelihood that I'm gonna show up to office hours is probably not high because I probably am feeling a lot of feelings about my lack of confidence, right? And so how can you support that with learning technology? Bring feedback forward. Scaffold the writing process, that's another approach. And the other is, all right, if AI detection is one artifact, what are other artifacts we can bring into the conversation? A process report. How can we expose the writing process and not here's where a student clicked, here's where they copied paste, here's an essay playback, because that's a little bit too big brother, and maybe overwhelming if I have 100 students and an essay every other week. But how can I just get a really quick glimpse into what the student has done in their writing process? And again, give students access to that same information. So I do think that we should be using technology as a lever, but we can't use AI detection in a vacuum because we know that's just going to be harmful and ultimately cost a lot if we're wrong in many, many ways.
Yeah. No, and I would agree with that. So Turnitin obviously has AI detection capabilities. We launched those in early 2023. And AI detection is always meant to be a data point to support a conversation. I think when we talk specifically about what does technology do, it acts as an aid. It's a supporting tool. I think that integrity is uniquely human work. So upholding integrity is still that conversation that I have with a student when they need additional assistance, guiding them in the right direction, not making assumptions about whether or not they engaged in misconduct, but acknowledging that something needs to change. So when we look at our overall solutions and what we provide, again, these are data points to help inform decision-making, not be the deciding factor. So when I think of, how can we best support students, it's always conversational. It's about creating opportunity for exchange. It's about building community, right? And making space for safety. I believe there's sometimes a lack of feeling of safety for students because they don't feel like, hey, I can make a mistake, right? I'm gonna be penalized if I don't get a good grade or I'm gonna get poor marks. And when I talk to instructors and when I talk to students, that always comes up. It's that I need safety. I need to be able to make a mistake so I can learn from it and move forward.
Yeah, there's two parts to this conversation, and before I get into the technology side, I think it's important to look at the behaviors of students. So the president of Yorkville University, Julia Christensen Hughes, she's an academic integrity researcher, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the EdUp podcast. Shout out Elvin if you know him. And she said students cheat because they feel cheated. So if they feel cheated, who's created that environment? And I don't want to put this entirely on the institution because we're all part of this ecosystem, but this goes back to, do students care about what they're learning? Do they have that curiosity and motivation to actually do the work that matters to them? So the way we're approaching this from the technology side is we're actually building something new right now. It's entirely different, I would say, from my colleagues over here. It pulls upon a framework called the Swiss cheese model of academic integrity. So everyone, close your eyes and picture a piece of Swiss cheese and it has holes, right? And if you layer multiple pieces of Swiss cheese, then you can say that each layer of your academic integrity process is now solid. And so the way we're approaching this is looking at author continuity. Does the student's thinking and writing match their own sample? So rather going across a large database, we're just looking at the student. So it's very student-centered. And then, we're looking at, are there elements of chaos? Because humans are chaotic. We're on a panel right now, and I really didn't know what I was gonna say this morning. I had a sense, but there's chaos here. And the two other parts are, instead of looking for whether or not they used AI, because I would say that's table stakes today, is empowering instructors to set an AI assessment scale and then having students self-validate that knowledge through a quasi-viva voce and a closed test, so a gap question. Because regardless if students use AI or not, if we can show that they have the knowledge through those learning outcomes, then I think that confers the value of the degree they've earned.
Yeah, I love hearing that all of you are basically saying, well, these are tools, but they're just one data point. And I am not sure, and I don't know about the audience, we can talk about it later, but I'm not sure that the faculty necessarily see it that way, right? So our dean of, our University Ombuds office is overwhelmed, and the Dean of Students office is overwhelmed with cheating cases because whatever detector they used said that you cheated. And so, and if we look at, even a 4% false positive rate is not unusual, and so you're sending 4% of your students to the dean of students for cheating, and they have no recourse because the tool said they did. So I would love that conversation, like this is a data point, this tells you something, but there must be other things.
Right.
I think that's a great conversation to have, and it sort of ties in a little bit, I think, with faculty training. So I don't think we have any AI agnostics, as I call them here, because you don't come to this place if you are one, right? But we have in our institutions lots of people that don't want to have anything to do with AI. And so put in their syllabus, no AI on anything, and use detectors to pick it up. So how can we train faculty be better prepared for this AI world? And maybe start making.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that part of preparation is in understanding what you're dealing with, right? So having a baseline education on what is a large language model, what is an AI agent, how do these things work? And then I think the second question is, does it make sense for my student to be using them within my discipline? I don't know that I agree that we should be looking at the final outcome as, the evidence of whether or not learning occurred. I think that evidence is in the process of how we get there. So I would almost see AI use as a way to refine a final piece of work because the importance lies in getting from point A to point B. When we talk about what educators need, from a tool perspective, I think that's an easier question to answer. Let's educate them on technology. Work with a partner that's willing to come in and talk to your educators and even talk to your students about how these tools work. And provide everyone with transparency into how we develop the tools, how the scoring methodology works, what other data points do we have, because it's not just an AI detection score. We have a multitude of other authorship analytics that can point to whether or not the paper is actually sourced by the student or by another party, whether that's another person or a machine. The conversation, though, that I keep having when I do engagement events with my customers is around soft skills. And so I think that soft skills and professional development are also something that universities and colleges should provide, because that conversation piece is what supports formative feedback. So when we talk about what tools do we have and how do we use those tools, that's one piece of the puzzle. But the underlying foundation is, how do I have the conversation with the student once I have the data? And so, again, and I'll say it's never start with an accusation. We want to ask open-ended questions. We want to explore. We don't want to make assumptions that students are doing the wrong thing, because what I often find is students are using tools that are given to them by their institution. So they're using something like Copilot, maybe they're even using a ChatGPT or Claude, and they think that that's okay to use because they don't understand the parameters that the instructor has laid out for ethical use. So part of that training too comes down to, in my discipline, does it make sense for my student to be using AI? Now, in a Writing 101 course, probably not, right? Because the purpose is to help build writing skills. But if I'm in a business course and I'm having to maybe refine some ideas or put together an outline or a summary, it may not matter if I use AI to help me along with that, because the final output is what matters.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with all your points. And just zooming out to the policy level, thinking about whether there's due process and there's procedure in place, because are there any adjunct faculty in the room here? There are a few, okay. So, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel sometimes that adjunct faculty will often may not be incentivized to follow that due process because of the track that they're on. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Why would they not use it?
Because they're afraid of getting poor ratings from students and that it impacted them down the road. I've heard that from faculty before. I'm just curious if that aligns.
Not all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think they're right. It's everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah.
But also there's a time aspect.
Yeah.
We're actually just talking about more time out of their day.
Yes.
Very well
Yep.
Yeah.
The administrative piece.
That you don't get paid for, right? So.
Yeah, so having appropriate policy for all faculty is important, but also for students. We run a global well-being study. We've been doing this for 10 years, but only the last 3 years in the US. And students, 80% of students said they're stressed that they're going to be wrongfully accused. And now that stress level correlates whether or not your institution has a policy on appropriate use or not. So if you have appropriate use policies and can provide sanction tools, you're automatically lowering that stress, which then will help faculty down the road when those situations may or may not arise. So just looking at the policy piece is critical here. And then working with partners on the ground, we find the ability to redesign teaching and learning in your writing pedagogies. There's differing skills across the institution, so not all faculty may understand or have the capabilities to be able to provide that level of support in the classroom, so training faculty on that, I think, is a huge piece.
When I think about professional development, teaching and learning, I also need to preface this with this. I'm like a disgusting optimist. So you need to identify that a lot of what I say is like best case scenario. We're living in the bubbles, okay? So I don't naturally think through all of the edge cases of bad actors. So I'm just going to preface with that. But providing faculty with a policy, I do not believe is professional development. I think that's like table stakes, and I think we agree with that. Mm-hmm. And when we're providing professional development for faculty, do we want to be providing them, this is your guide to shut down academic dishonesty, or this is your guide to encourage ownership? Mm-hmm. And true learning and thinking, and that's the path I want to go down. I want to spend all of my time there because it's proactive. It's about making our students more motivated, more confident, more successful. So, but reality, right? Edge case. This is why I always hire a curmudgeon CFO, because I need the balance. But how can we give real professional development around like the Swiss cheese model? I love that, and then also the real teaching and learning piece. So there's a really great body of research. I'm going to botch citing the source, but I want to say I found it in some sort of, inside higher ed type publication. It was like, these are 6 low lift actions every faculty can take throughout the start of the term, at the start, before, during, after, to prevent academic dishonesty and bring down the cases by something like 50%. And it was like, have an academic integrity quiz. And I totaled how much time this would take, and it was like 180 minutes throughout the start of a term. When you put all of those together, it's really powerful. It was like academic integrity quiz, explain the why behind your academic integrity policy. Someone on this panel yesterday said students don't dislike rules, they dislike arbitrary rules. It was I can't remember his name, but thank you for saying that. Explain the why. It was have a no harm take back policy, where if a student submits a piece of work, they can take it back without any harm. And of course, there's probably a grade penalty on the taking back of the submission and resubmitting it, but still it was, I won't report you to the dean if you take back your submission within X days after assignment. So you could probably Google and find it was like 6 techniques to reduce academic integrity. On the other side, when we think about good quality teaching and learning, I think academic integrity is really a learning design opportunity for us. I love this framework. It's called Zimmerman's self-regulated model of learning. And it really focuses on how there are multiple kind of points of learning for a student. There's a planning phase, there's a performance phase, and there's a reflection phase. And what you can actually do is redesign assessments to follow this model. There are guides if you want to look on how to do it. You could just Google, you probably ask chat, how could I redesign my essay to follow Zimmerman's theory? But it's something as simple as, add in a peer review phase, add in a self-reflection phase, break down a large assignment into small pieces. I know scale is an issue for a lot of people, so maybe instead of doing this for 4 assignments, you lower your assignments by 1 and do it for 3. So I think professional development needs to be really tactical, and it needs to be related to teaching and learning and how we encourage ownership, motivation, confidence, not just swat the bad actors.
Yeah, that's great. I think, and you're touching upon, changes in assessments, right? So we focus on continuing, well, we're perhaps continuing on what we've always done, but the times have changed. And I think, I always look at, when I look at assessments, they haven't necessarily changed over the last few decades. I think the biggest change came during COVID when we all went online and we discovered that you can do these online assessments, and Canvas auto-graded quizzes are fantastic. Perhaps, but and I think we got to be careful because we have to understand what is it that we're testing, right? So are we testing very low level of Bloom's taxonomy things like memorization? And sure, a quiz that's self-graded can do that really well, but are we testing, creating things or really learning things? How do you best do that? And so I think now we're at the age of AI, and what is it that we have to change in assessment? Do we? I was interviewed by a reporter from AP who's doing a story on oral examinations, and is that a thing? And I go, we have 60,000 students at our institution, and they're all in multiple classes. That's not a feasible thing. Yes, it's a gold standard of assessment, having a conversation with the student to find out what they know. So I want to start with Jared. How can we change assessments? What is it that we should change? Are there structural things we have to do to manage our classes differently?
There's a trend I'm seeing where writing across the curriculum is coming back, or whack is back, as they say. And I started to notice this about 16 months ago, where a partner I was working with in Georgia were revising all their curriculum across not just the humanities and social sciences, but science courses as well, information technology courses, to bring in writing, and specifically in those types of courses, reflective writing. And using reflection as a type of modality to understand where student knowledge is at. And over the last 16 months, I've seen this popping up across the US now, where specific institutions are embedding writing in your non-standard writing courses. And I think that's a powerful opportunity to redesign assessment through that.
I think I already talked about Zimmerman's, so I'll say Google Zimmerman's. I love it. There are a lot of practical applications. One thing I'll say, and it's been said by you, it's been said by so many people, but it's process, not product. And I think it's such a good shift, because ultimately what we're here to do is make sure students are learning and using their brains and critically thinking and collaborating, all of the good stuff. At the same time, that is such a high lift on faculty. So I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge the fact that not everybody has the time, the resources, the energy, the course size to actually scalably do a process-based learning assignment. So if that's not for you, I have a lot of empathy for you, and I don't have the best solutions, if I'm being honest. What I do think we need to do as folks who support education, educators, is make sure we don't throw away universal learning design in the hopes of making sure everything is authentic. For a lot of students, writing in a blue book for 2 hours is a really challenging task. For a lot of students, getting to class 100% of the time and losing the opportunity to sign in via Zoom was really great for them. I think about my best friend in college was chronically ill, and I had to advocate for her to be able to just log in via Zoom, whatever it would be. The last thing I'll say is how we think about rethinking assessment is there are some faculty who are jonesing at the opportunity and want to bring in generative AI to their assessments. They want to accept the reality, which is students need to learn how to use generative AI responsibly, and that means evaluate the outputs. Learn not even how to prompt it. Prompting is, I'm not even worried about prompting, it's evaluating the outputs, right? And so how can we give faculty resources, and how can we start having more open conversations about having assessments that actually require the use of generative AI, or at least, assume students are going to be using generative AI. And I think everybody needs to have opportunity and a seat at the table.
So I'm going to say something that's maybe a little bit controversial. And controversial coming from somebody who works in tech. I think the future of learning is in, and what we look, when we think about assessment design, what that looks like, is less in the tools. And I think that when I think about what generative AI is and what it can accomplish, what I see all of this technology doing, to your point, is really taking up a lot of our time, right? Because I have to learn how to use all of these tools. A lot of these tools don't integrate with each other. I'm looking at reports, I'm looking at scores, I'm looking at all of this technology while sometimes not fully understanding the technology that's the threat. So it's kind of like a perfect storm. And so when we talk about creating more time in tech, we usually frame that as, I'm gonna make grading faster and easier for you. I'm gonna make the scores and the data that you look at easier for you to interpret. And those are all really good things, but they're just tools. They're just data points. I think the future of assessment, when I think about what students need today to be successful in the workforce, is again, uniquely human. Unique human skills, like being able to sit together and come up with ideas or outlines, to be conversational, to be able to argue and find a common ground, right? Those are all skills that we're doing day to day in the workplace, right? But for some reason in education, we're putting everything in a LMS quiz, or it's like a multiple choice, or it's a Scantron, or it's this or it's that. I think that assessment has to mirror what it will be like for most people in the real world. And in the real world, the skill that is going to be, I think, most highly sought after is communication. And you don't get good communication without forcing people together into a room and making them uncomfortable and having them talk to each other. So I think assessment should be multimodal, right? But it needs to start, I think, with in-person discussion. And then you use assistive technology to help understand, hey, did students learn anything through these conversations? Did they learn anything creating this work together? And I think that's what creates workforce preparedness, when you're also alongside that teaching them how to use AI and other tools in an assistive way.
Yeah, thanks. I fully agree. And it's also this whole discussion about what's the worth of a college degree, right? This is coming up everywhere, certainly in our state it's coming up. And when I think about that, I've not been in school for 35 years or so. And what is it that I use from my education? It is those kinds of things, right? It's problem solving, structuring information, communicating in various forums, written and oral. Critical thinking.
Yes.
And it's interesting to me because we don't teach critical thinking per se, right? We throw students a bunch of assignments and they have to critically think about them to solve them, and that's how we teach it. And so, I fully agree. I like that discussion, and I think it is up to us, the faculty, to realize that and make these changes. So I want to switch a little bit, because you're all companies that have tools for sale, right? So you're trying to understand this environment of us, faculty, teaching students, and how do you go about positioning your tools in that space? And we'll start with Kelsey.
Yeah, I don't want to feed a fed horse, as they say, but I think for us, it's really about how do you motivate, encourage a student to own the learning process, to really be in it. How do you give educators pathways, tools to drive purpose and meaning? Because again, when a student has a connection to the course material, and it might be through the educator. I mean, I tricked students into loving chemistry because they loved me. That was my mode. I was like, we're gonna blow stuff up together and you're gonna love this course, right? And so for us, I think we're never going to lose that. That's always gonna be our core belief, our core mission, is we get students engaged. Our very first pedagogical framework that we built our platform on is self-determination theory, which is the conditions required for a student to be truly intrinsically motivated. It works for students, it works for humans, it works for my partner, it works for my employees. They need to have autonomy, so they need to have choice. They need to have purpose and connection. So again, I think that's where the teacher is the most important, the educator. And third is they need to have competence. You cannot fail over and over and over and still be continued to persevere. So giving students real-time feedback, giving them feedback from non-generative AI, giving them feedback from generative AI, giving them feedback from their peers, giving them feedback from their educator, that all drives competence. All of those three things together make an intrinsically motivated person. So for us, again, academic integrity, yes, it's about preventing bad actors, and we always have to put our bad actor hat on and think, how are they gonna try to get out of this thing? But then flip it to, how do we motivate? How do we drive competency, ownership, and purpose and connection? That's our jam.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, so Turnitin's been in the integrity space for, 27 years now, I think we're going on. And we first started off as a system that was able to identify collusion, right? So in-class collusion and matching papers, across campus. That has evolved rapidly over time to include all of the grading and feedback tools that we deliver today, in addition to AI indication, authorship analytics, solutions for secure high-stakes assessment. So we really run the gamut, I think, between how do we provide meaningful feedback to students to encourage the process of learning, because the process of learning is the most crucial and important thing. The end artifact, I believe was the word you used, matters very little, right, if I don't understand how a student got there. So a lot of our tools today and how that looks are in that formative feedback space and in trying to create that conversation and trying to create that opportunity for learning to happen and to have, for the first time, visibility directly into what the writing process looks like, because we're talking specifically about written assessment, right? Being able to understand how a student formulates thoughts, right, and how those thoughts show up on paper in a final form is crucial, because it allows us to pinpoint where they need additional assistance. When we have AI tools as an assistive technology within that framework, we're able to understand how students are working with AI and are they prompting in a way that's going to make them successful in the future. So what we're trying to accomplish, and I think what we're successfully doing, is creating an environment where the student process is visible, where educators have an opportunity to intervene or remediate as needed, and where you also have data to support when things get off the rails and maybe when misconduct occurs, because while I also prefer to look at the world through rose-colored lenses, misconduct happens, and that is a fact, right? And so those are things that we also have to be aware of and take into consideration. So having that data is super crucial because it helps an educator feel supported in that conversation when it's needed.
I think it's fair to say we all provide some form of formative feedback, and then that is helpful for driving student confidence, student motivation. So, what we're doing is looking at providing academic support and learning validation. So we've been in the provision of academic support and study skills for the last 20 years, and that was done by humans for quite a long time. It's still done by humans, but we're now amplifying the speed of that feedback and support through AI. So it's the same mission, same goals, but now increasing the speed and starting with pedagogy first. So it's always help, not answers. There's no option for student to click and accept changes or accept rewrites or humanize their text, because that undermines the goals. And so one of the things that we see with our partners is using formative feedback as a method to improve retention. So how do we get there? So when students are not seeking support, it could be a few different reasons. They may not be motivated, they may not be confident, maybe a social factor. I don't see myself as needing help. And so starting with the confidence piece and giving that in the right amount of feedback can really drive students to use more of your on-campus services. And we see this time and time again where a new university is looking at Studiosity and they'll say, well, are you going to replace our writing center? I'm going to say, no, you're actually going to be busier after. And so the reason for that is once students get that low barrier support, they start to see and believe in themselves, and then they're going to start using more of your on-campus services, whether that's going to the library, going to the writing center, peer advising, peer tutoring, whatever that may be. And so with that help-seeking piece, there's also the component of critical thinking skills. Hull and IQ had their skills week a couple weeks ago in DC, and the top 2 of the 3 skills were critical thinking and effective communicating, which you both said and articulated very well, so I won't hammer that home. But how do we do that? So when a student is working in Studiosity for feedback, we're going to assess what level of critical thinking was shown throughout their paragraph and their essay or lab report, whatever that writing is, and then give them some literacy skills on why critical thinking is important, because they know they're being assessed on it, but they may not know what it is or why it's important. So starting with the knowledge piece. And then we're going to say, perhaps, to increase those critical thinking skills, you've shown an understanding of X. Now let's move up to applying and evaluating. And so always giving them suggestions, never direct examples, and then signposting and referring them back to your services to complete that learning loop. And then, as I mentioned before, we're working on the learning validation piece, which is ensuring that there's evidence of student knowledge and gain that they self-validate. And validity is set by you, the institution, and your instructors. It's not set by us. And if students don't reach that validity threshold because, academic integrity is a continuum, it's not one and done, then let's get them back into the support side of things. And so it's this constant loop of ensuring that they're developing those skills in a proper way.
Great. On the sort of the last question before we open it up to the audience is about the future, right? So OpenClaw is here. And agents were mentioned earlier. And, great tools, incredibly scary. I haven't dared to load it up on my machine, and my CEO is there and says, do not do that, and it's going to steal everything you have. But in this age of, you said it's about process, but I could see OpenClaw doing that process. And so are you, as a company, prepared to this age? Are you working on that? Is that something that we can look forward to?
I don't know if any of us are prepared, if I'm being honest. I think this is a very hard problem to solve for, is the reality in which any human being can download software onto the computer that just acts on behalf of them. I remember having this conversation with my team 2 years ago and a year ago. It's an arms race. And if all we're doing is just trying to keep up with the next tool, we are all gonna just feel so tired and defeated. And I think as educators, and I think about my time teaching, if all I was ever trying to do was just solve every problem ahead of me, I was just gonna feel like I'm boiling the ocean. These are real, and we have to assume that our students are seeing TikToks of it and have access to it. I think it just brings us back to the question of, all right, I'm not going to spend my time, my energy, for me, my money, on trying to figure out if a student used OpenClaw or blocked them from using, like a browser add-on. I'm just going to go back to how do I encourage my students to actually want to learn? And yes, we know that every single student isn't signing up for their higher education degree because they really want it. We know that there are some students who have other reasons why they're there, but go back to that. Go back to the root problem of why a student might download that OpenClaw and use that, which is they don't have time, they're not motivated, they don't have the skills. Let's focus on that, because that is so in our control, and that's so why we wake up every single day and do what we're supposed to do. And then also I hire really smart people who hopefully will solve that one for me and figure out how to, Swiss cheese it out, as you say. But I think the reality of the situation is we don't know how to fight it. We just really don't. And we can continue to try to play the catch-up game, but probably not what wakes us up in the morning, right?
Yeah, great. Megan?
Yeah, so I would say that agentic AI has been on our radar for a bit. It's not a new concept to us. something that keeps me up at night are large language platforms coming to a theater near you soon. So I think that the technology evolves very rapidly, and I've heard the comparison of arms race. I think that what's important is having dedicated teams that are solving for the problems that exist today, right? And then having teams that are looking at what's happening 5 years from now. So for us at Turnitin, it's about proactivity. It's not really about what am I trying to do today to mitigate an AI agent from being able to be used in a written assessment. It's what can I immediately do, and then what do I do to future-proof it? And so future-proofing is a big part of our roadmap. I would say that from a technical solution perspective, we are going to be rolling out things like ability to identify virtual machines, malicious IP addresses, and things that are a little bit more technical that would point you in the direction of whether or not agentic AI is being used, or if somebody masquerading as the student is in the actual environment and taking an assessment on their behalf or writing on their behalf. I think we have some other measures in place that, especially with clarity, where if we look at things like how long it took somebody to write an actual writing assignment, right? If they're using an AI agent, the timing on that assignment is going to be, hey, they wrote 2,000 words in 3 minutes, and we know that that's not possible. Now, was that feature designed to point you to maybe an AI agent or an LLM? Not necessarily, but it does the job, right? So we have certain features, I think, that can point you into the direction that today that something has occurred, and then forthcoming we will have more data and analytics to provide from a technical perspective that point to actual browser extensions or, you know, things that have been uploaded to a device via a USB. That's possible now too. When we talk specifically about high-stakes secure assessment, we take the guesswork out of it by disabling internet, Bluetooth, and AirDrop on all laptops once a student enters a secure assessment. So once they're in that environment, they can't access anything that's on the laptop except for the test itself. And that's super important when we talk about programmatic assessment, because we're talking about high-stakes learning, where the nursing student that I'm teaching today is going to graduate and go work in a hospital. And I really hope when I go to that hospital emergency room that the nurse actually did their work and that they were actually taking part in that learning process. So integrity is crucial. It's I think, large picture, and we can focus in certain areas and say, hey, this one is more important than the other, but I think they're all equally important things for us to consider.
Yeah, there's quite a wide spectrum here between OpenClaw and no AI. Like I think we can all agree that OpenClaw is primarily bad if it's being used in the wrong way. And, you know, where's the middle ground, right? And so, you know, I think it comes down to, and I say think because I believe anyone who says something certain about the future of AI is probably doesn't really know themselves. So I admit that I don't really know where we're going with this, but I'll submit to you that OpenClaw has some really dangerous qualities to it, and I don't fully believe students will understand that. You know, the ability to write and execute code on your own laptop and have access to your institutional email and all of those arms, it's quite scary. And so I think it comes back to, you know, the opportunity, the rationalization, and the incentives or pressure of higher education. You know, this is what they call in finance the fraud triangle, right? So if you reduce pressure and, you know, reduce opportunity, but rationalize what we're doing, students may, you know, seek to violate academic integrity rules for any one of those reasons. So, you know, the last piece that I'll just conclude with is thinking about curiosity. Right? If students are curious, there's going to be a likelihood they're very motivated and will not use those tools for nefarious purposes. And so when you think about research, you know, research is just organized curiosity. So if we can, you know, bring back those relationships with students and faculty and involve them in some sort of, you know, curious process or a research process, I think there's a real opportunity where we can shift the narrative and behavior on the types of tools that they may or may not use for those various reasons.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm going to open it up for a few questions. We have 6 minutes left.
Has AI actually led to learning improvements?
Has AI led to better learning outcomes?
What is the empirical data that shows us that AI has improved learning in students? And if so, in what domains?
So my take on that is that too soon to tell, right? I think a lot of students who are using AI today haven't graduated, so we wouldn't know if they went on to further success in their careers, right? There are some studies out there, and I don't want to rain on anybody's research because I think all research is important. But I think if you're trying to measure, does AI improve learning outcomes? Well, it's an assistive technology, so I would hope so. That's how I view AI, right? It should help me sound and look better because AI is kind of a performance in a way. AI can sound a lot better than I can sound, and it's masking my voice. So it should sound, more relatable. It should sound better than I do. It should sound like it's doing a better job and that I'm more well-informed. But I think if we take off the layer and we look at the process again, what did I actually learn, or was I just leaning into AI? And what does my trajectory look like in my career after I no longer have access to those tools in school? And I think that's the research we don't have. It's like, what does that look like long term? So I'm not a big optimist on AI improves learning outcomes. I think that the key is in ethical use and using it as assistive technology and ensuring that students are still engaged in process and that the process is where we identify whether or not they've achieved learning outcomes.
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in? Jared?
Yeah, so over the last close to 24 months now, through our partners we work with across various countries and continents, we've published 12 different studies that were written by these universities. So some in the UK, some Middle East, North Africa, Asia Pacific. And there are various categories where we've seen improvements. But the eternal question is, what does that look like post-graduation? We only have early indicators right now, and I'd be happy to share that research with you afterwards. It's openly available. So it's something we're looking out for, and we're already planning to put money towards investment towards looking at that when the time comes.
I'm very fortunate to have a CTO who's an academic, and part of his job description is to find me a bunch of research about active learning principles and their impact on learning. So there are some published studies, and I will say it's early and they're small, right? They're spread out, and they're not looking at thousands of students, and they're not looking at years of time, but there is conclusive research that shows unfiltered access to GPT in academic environments, and they were using ChatGPT for this, so I should say just Gen AI, leads to lower performance on end of term assessments. And then on the flip side, access to AI tools that are designed around active learning principles lead to stronger academic outcomes once you take the AI away. But I think that's just reflective of strong learning design, and implementation of active learning principles will lead to better outcomes. So I always like to think of Bloom's 2 sigma problem, right? When students are getting real-time feedback from a coach, a tutor, they're going to perform 2 standard deviations higher than their peers. It's really hard to replicate at scale. AI will allow us to do that, but only if the AI is not doing the work for the student.
Yeah, great. I think I'm going to close it there. I want to end with encouraging you to come to the last 2 sessions. The session after the break at 10:30 is the ethics work group, where the panel will consider policy, ethical, and legal implications of creative use and security of artificial intelligence systems. And then at 11:30, following that, we will have the fluff test, which is a simple practical framework for strengthening how people interact with Gen AI. And you can do this at your institution. So I hope you will come to those. And I would like to thank the panel. Thank you.